Putin stepping up to the plate today and saying
that Russia signed the document making Crimea a part of Russia. He spoke for about an hour. He was very
he spoke in the Russian parliament?
He spoke in the Russian parliament. Basically, every figure in the government was there, and he spoke to huge applause. And he said the West, declare Kosovo independent, so we're going to declare Crimea independent. Crimea and Russia really want this. Russians really want it. Crimea voted to become part of Russia, so how can we not ignore the free will of the people?
All right, and so So yesterday, the president came out with some tough sanctions.
Yeah,
tougher sanctions, and Putin not a dent, right?
Yeah, Putin basically brushed this off. My colleague Christina Wilkie and I have a piece about the Russian and American reactions to it. In D.C., the lobbyist reaction was kind of like, phew, this wasn't as bad as we hoped. The Russian markets actually rallied because the sanctions were not as tough as they wanted them to be. And in Russia, the reaction among the sanctions was kind of bemusement. They're like, "Oh, I'm sanctioned? Really?"
Oh.
They were kind of surprised and being like, it was like a badge of honor for them to be sanctioned. They said, "Thank you for sanctioning me." Well,
what's interesting to me, and this was discussed at our briefing a little bit yesterday without getting a clear answer, is in applying sanctions against anybody who contributed to the breakup of Crimea from Ukraine, Vladimir Putin was not one of those sanctioned.
Right. I mean, I think it's a really big step to sanction a head of state. But
the guy who's really responsible is Putin, right?
Yeah, I mean, Putin makes the policy, and along with a very small inner circle, some of them were on that list, but some of them weren't on the EU's list. And as you know, Russians love holding their money in London or in other European banks.
Right. So, the Crimeans, is it over now? I mean, is this the fact is that with all of our bluster and everything, Putin has managed to annex Crimea, and Ukraine survives. He said, by the way, also this morning, they had no interest in any other part of Ukraine.
Right.
Do we believe that?
Well, we don't know. I mean, he said he had no interest, but I think the way he phrased it, and I'm going by the rough translation, is that, I think he would kind of leave the option open. I mean, Lavrov said he had no plans to invade southern or eastern Ukraine. And then the next day, Russia seized a gas plant just outside Crimea. So we really don't know. I mean, I wouldn't take these things necessarily at face value. They're less than Sherman-esque.
Well, the big question that I've had for a while and also came up at the briefing yesterday was, in the big scheme of things, what does it matter if Crimea is part of Russia?
Well, I think Crimea being part of Russia, the West won't recognize it. The European Union will not recognize it.
But if it's part of Russia, again, what does that? Doesn't matter, right? I mean, if they're part of Russia, they don't need individual recognition.
Well, I think it matters for a few reasons. I mean, it'll still be on maps. It'll still be a part of Ukraine. Ukraine will still say this is our territory. It will ruin, any kind of investment that Crimea gets because it'll be this disputed territory. So, international recognition does kind of have matter.
Right. Does Putin have designs beyond Crimea, do you think? I mean, let's talk about the vice president's trip. It's no accident that he's in Eastern Europe. He's in Poland today. He's going to Lithuania. What's his message?
Well, I think he wants to reassure.
And what's the purpose of this trip?
Yeah, he wants to reassure some of those countries. By the way, the Baltic states are EU members and they're NATO members. So that's something more than Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I don't think Putin's about to invade the Baltics or invade Poland. But those countries are very nervous. They see Putin, bringing troops into a sovereign nation outside his borders, and that is, very worrying for Poland and very worrying for the Baltic states who were annexed by the Soviet Union, and the U.S. never recognized that.
We just talked to, at the top of the hour, to Peter Baker from the New York Times, who reminded us of the parallel to 2008 when Putin and Russian forces invaded Georgia.
Right.
And Putin ended up getting some territory, and again, nothing we could do about it, right?
Right. There are similarities. Putin invaded, South Ossetia and Abkhazia were two kind of disputed territories already that were de facto controlled by Russian allied forces, and Georgia kind of tried to make a move on it, and Russia responded with overwhelming force. Russia did not go into Tbilisi, did not try to take over other parts of Georgia, but they got those territories back, and they sent a message to the then very pro-Western Mikhail Saakashvili that if you try to take those territories for Georgia, you'll be reprimanded. And they're still de facto controlled by Russians. They have Russian troops there. I think Putin's looking for a similar thing in Crimea. And
we tend to think of this from our perspective, right? This is an outrage. These are sovereign this is a sovereign state, and these are sacred borders, and all that kind of stuff. And how dare Putin do something so crazy? Domestically, internally in Russia, this is not hurting Putin inside of Russia, is it?
No, there are various anti-war protests going on in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but Putin's approval rating is very high right now. I think most Russians probably want Crimea to be a part of Russia. So Putin's ratings, as measured by state-owned pollsters, which is tricky to exactly pinpoint, but I think there is some truth that he's getting a huge popularity surge because of this, as all leaders do during a war.
Yeah, and I saw that it's a big standing ovation in the parliament today or whatever.
Huge Soviet-style cheering, rhythmic clapping. It was something else.
Well, after he blew $50 billion on the Olympics, maybe this is his way of... we were wondering, why would he do this to squander all the goodwill that he got out of the Olympics? Maybe we're looking at it the wrong way, right? The reason he did this is to change the subject and to say, well, you see, so what? I might spend a lot of money on the Olympics, but I'm standing for the motherland, right?
The Olympics, if this had happened before the Olympics, I would assume that you would have heard the boycott calls grow much louder than before that. But Putin freed some political prisoners, like the Women of Pussy riot, and granted amnesty to Alexei Navalny and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, had the Olympics. Then you have this Ukraine action where the West is just up in arms about it.
Yeah, that's amazing that they could do this, and this may be. And the Russian market has responded. At one time it fell, right? But now it's rebounded.
So right after the Russian troops entered Crimea, the Russian market plunged at least 10%. The ruble plunged against the dollar and the euro. It was looking pretty bad. Now, after the sanctions, it went up about 3 to 5%. So it's gained a little bit of it back. But I think the chances of any sort of economic recovery in Russia for the year are gone because of this.
Elisa tells me we have some of the audio from Putin's speech through translator.
Yeah, it's a translator here.
Unless Luke is going to do the translation here. But
I guess this is him starting out saying Crimea was always part of Russia.
In the heart and the conscience of people, Crimea has always been and remains an inalienable part of Russia. This conviction was unshakable and was transferred from generation to generation.
Inalienable part of Russia. Yeah. I mentioned yesterday we were talking with Joe Cirincione. In this week's New Yorker magazine, David Remnick points out that Solzhenitsyn, who was the great critic, of the Soviet Union at the time, has written and said he thinks Ukraine, the entire Ukraine, belongs to Russia and should be part of Russia. So it is that Russian nationalism is a really strong force, isn't it?
Right. And I saw Mikhail Gorbachev the other day, who the West loves, said that the Crimean referendum results should be respected, and he wanted Crimea to be a part of Russia. So, I think, even there are Russians who think what Putin is doing is bad, but even, someone like Gorbachev is, very for Crimea joining. That said, he gave it up, so this is a good way for him to kind of get it back. But, he's backing this as well.